So I try to record these videos in a way that'll still be meaningful if you see them 5 years from now and don't know the context for what's going on. Boy, the lighting is really terrible. See, if I move closer, my face turns blue because the light coming off of my computer monitor is slightly blue. If I move back, I look a little bit more like a human being. But boy, my lighting is really terrible. Oh, that's better. Yeah, right. Look, there was a video just put up by Charles Vegan Cheetah, and he obviously was taken a little bit by surprise by someone asking him, look, have you ever been to a dairy farm? Do you know about this stuff firsthand yourself? This question and this example is meaningful to me in a bunch of different ways. It's come up in my life under a bunch of different headings. This is the big empirical question of our time, and especially if you deal with left-wing people. Have you ever been to a garment factory? Have you ever been to a shoe factory in a third world country? Have you ever been to a rice farm, to a dairy farm, to whatever it's a meaningful question, whatever the case may be. And my whole life, I've had to deal with basically left-wing people. It's never been a right-wing person. Left-wing people making over-the-top revolutionary claims, basically cynical political claims based on misrepresenting the terrible oppression that supposedly goes on in factories, farms, or what have you. And veganism is no exception, but veganism is not unique in this way because I've dealt with it under so many different headings. I can remember talking to a privileged vegan, that's her screen name. She's another YouTuber here. We had just one conversation by Skype, her and I. And I was saying to her, the stuff you say on your channel, it seems to me that you think there's no way for a person to have a life of dignity, to have a good quality of life, to earn an honest living, working on a farm. Why do you think that? Have you been to a rice farm? Have you been to a vegetable farm? Have you been to a banana farm? Have you spent time with farmers? Have you researched it? Have you seen it? Those are worthwhile questions to ask within the vegan bubble, like when we're talking about vegetable farming or mango farming or fruit farming, whatever you want to say. And they're also, I think, meaningful questions to ask, of course, when we're talking about meat production, dairy production, what have you. To use Charles's own idiom, there's also this problem of vegans living inside an intellectual ghetto. And from my perspective, that's true of the whole left wing in every part of the world I've ever lived in. It's very easy for you to live inside a group of people who never challenge your assumptions about how clothing is made, what goes on a farm. And if step one of your political perspective on the world is already detached from empirical reality, if you aren't actually involved with strawberry farms, it becomes very easy for you to convince yourself that you know better than everyone who disagrees with you. You're left-wing, you only hang out with left-wing people. You have the belief that everyone who works on a strawberry farm is horrendously exploited. In fact, that the exploitation of human labor on strawberry farms is so bad that vegans should feel guilty for eating strawberries in the same way that a meat eater should feel guilty for eating pork. As if the conditions of someone employed and being paid minimum wage, let's say, on a strawberry farm are just as bad as, or worse than, a pig that is born to live and die in a steel cage on a concrete floor, having its tail cut off, having its teeth pulled out, in the case of male pigs, being castrated through an incredibly painful process. Sometimes these pigs only live for 3 months. Sometimes it's 6 months. Depends on the type of pig, etc. Really, there's no point of comparison. Really, it's completely surreal to have this perspective. And yet, right now, it is common amongst left-wing vegans. They live in an intellectual ghetto where these assumptions just get affirmed and reaffirmed by their selected circle of friends. And, the question hasn't come up. Well, have you been to a pig farm? This is one thing, sure. Well, have you ever worked for a day on a strawberry farm? Have you ever talked to someone or be friends with someone who maybe worked on a strawberry farm during the harvest season for a few years and then went back to school and got another job. People who work on farms are regular people. They don't necessarily do it as a career. They do it just for a few years or what have you. It includes migrant workers. You can talk to migrant workers who came from Mexico, worked on a strawberry farm in America for just 1 year, saved up some money, went back home, got another job, whatever it was. It's very often part of a form of upward social mobility. The picture is more nuanced than the propaganda that left-wing people want to manufacture out of it. And it doesn't even mean they have bad motives in creating this propaganda. But yes, step one is that the propaganda becomes detached from reality, from any kind of empirical experience. And I should note, the empirical experience can be living on the farm yourself, going to the factory yourself, but it can also be research-based. I did empirical research when I was living in Cambodia that consisted of going to factories and interviewing the factory workers to figure out how exploited they are. Very important form of research. I just mentioned I was doing more the analysis side of it, including mathematical analysis, quantitative methods. On that project, I was not physically there interviewing people face to face. I did do other projects where I was standing there while the interviews took place, and I actually observed the conditions and so on. Included visiting some very memorable chicken farms in Cambodia. Boy, yeah, and pig farms. Boy, you don't know. Oh God, you don't know a chicken farm till you've been on a chicken farm in Cambodia. Let me tell you. Oh, the adaptation of factory farming methods to third world tropical countries. It's ugly. But I've been there and I've seen that. Anyway, my point here was you can remain in touch with the empirical reality through research methods also, not just through going there yourself in person, but through reading research. Some of the questions we would ask the factory employees, these are garment factories where they make T-shirts like the one I'm wearing, they make clothing, make whatever. They're stitching pieces of cloth together. It included how happy or unhappy are you with the job? Do you feel you're making enough money or not enough money? Do you think you're working too many hours, etc.? How exploited are you in effect? How long have you had this job? What job do you plan to go on next after you finish this job? And with that project, the vast majority of the women, because I think they were all women working in the factory. I don't think any of them were men. The vast majority of the women, they were planning to keep the job for only a short time because they were earning so much money that they were saving up money to open their own shop, start their own business, or otherwise move on. So, the image of the assumption that all factory work in a third world country, all sweatshop labor is terrible exploitation. Well, I understand why you formed that opinion. I understand the political purpose it's put to. But it's tragic and self-defeating when little groups of left-wing people, little covens of left-wing people form their own intellectual ghettos and just affirm their assumptions about the world and assume that anyone who challenges their assumption is evil. Because now if you question that, if you're positioning me and say, well, I know something about factory conditions and I've been to factories and actually it's kind of a nuanced and complex picture, all of a sudden you're right-wing, you're evil, your heart is not in the right place because you don't agree with the propaganda line that's already been affirmed by, 10,000 conversations on Twitter or something, wherever these people get their sense of what reality is supposed to be. Part of the current fad of social justice warrior, left-wing slacktivism, of speaking out on issues on the internet, seems to be you base your opinion on reading maybe 2 paragraphs of information on the internet, maybe seeing some photographs of the most extreme example of something imaginable. And then the idea is that the morally correct thing to do is to make histrionic and extreme complaints on the internet, denouncing it and complaining about it in a totally closed-minded way that, of course, doesn't reflect any real-world experience. And that's why people who do this, but maybe everyone to some extent, that's why most people really do get stymied or flummoxed or shocked when someone asks them, like, well, when did you visit a dairy farm? What kind of dairy farms have you been to? It's a meaningful question. To what extent is your opinion guided by empirical experience, actually seeing things, actually having your hands on? And to what extent are you open now to having your political opinions challenged by empirical experience? I remember, this is like an almost uniquely Jewish thing. There was a wave of anti-sweatshop activism more than 10 years ago. There was a particular scandal about some particular factories in China, and there was this kind of incoherent, partly internet-driven response calling for an end to all sweatshop labor, an end to kind of all these garment factories. And I remember there was, I think it was one of the Jewish museums in Washington, D.C., Jewish Museum for Human Rights, something like that. One of the Jewish museums in America, they actually got a negative reaction from their donors, from the base of supporters for this human rights museum. Because they got together and said, look, these are very elderly Jewish people. But they said, look, I can remember when these sweatshops were here in the United States, whether it was the 1920s, the 1940s, whatever. I can remember what it was like to work in a garment factory, stitching blue jeans or stitching suits and ties or making T-shirts like this one. And this political movement, it's just fundamentally, factually wrong in trying to depict this as absolute slavery, as a circumstance of total exploitation of man by man. You know, you can lead a life with dignity, and you can earn a good living and an honest living doing this work. And I know because I did it back when I was a teenager in the 1940s or whatever it was. I say these were really elderly Jewish people in the United States who could remember when the United States had a booming garment industry and when it wasn't the case that America was reliant on importing their clothes from Asia. Now, when you're informed by empirical experience, it doesn't shut down the political discourse. It enriches it. It makes it meaningful. It makes it salient. And it gives you the basis. It gives you the tools. It equips you to come up with policy changes that are really relevant to the world we live in. I would think something similar is true about agriculture and factory farming. What this gets at, I mean, in contrast to the sort of left-wing internet activist habits of our time, is that not everybody is entitled to speak on everything. Some people know what they're talking about, and some people don't. Look, in some ways, I've led a terrible life. If I can make a separate video about just how miserable my life as an adult has been. There has been very little happiness in my adult life and a lot of misery. Take my word for it. But I did have some extraordinarily diverse experiences. I know what it's like to be in a garment factory and a shoe factory in third world countries in Southeast Asia. I got to go and visit those places and see them. I mentioned with shoe factories in the tropics, well, this is true of a lot of factories. A lot of times they don't have walls. You know, they have a roof, but they're open air with big fans so that it's cooler inside. So you don't even need to be invited inside to see the factory conditions. And I spent time on farms, and I did research about agriculture and manufacturing. Even when I was a kid, I visited farms when I was still in Canada, but I visited farms in Asia. My perspective is informed by some pretty diverse experience that some people definitely don't have when they're teenagers, and a lot of people don't have as older people either. And that doesn't mean that I'm right and you're wrong. But yeah, I mean, I'm making this video in response to the fact that Charles, he had a totally sincere and human reaction. He was thrown for a loop when someone said to him, posed some facts that contradicted his assumption, and he was challenged by someone asking him, hey, when have you ever been to a dairy farm? Well, if you're going to make political claims about how dairy farms ought to change or ought to be abolished, that is a challenge you should be ready to answer. And the same would be true if you're trying to reform the way clothing is manufactured and what have you. I remember I got some fan mail a while back someone was asking me, you keep saying in your videos that you're not left-wing, but you never describe what you are. And now after making this video, I feel like there's even more demand for me to state what my political beliefs are in the positive. But hey, if you watch all the videos on this channel, from the first to the last, maybe you add up all the negative statements, all the things I don't believe in, and you can come to some conclusions to what kind of guy I really am.